You have probably cut a watermelon many times in your life, maybe even hundreds of times. But there is a curious detail that almost no one notices. In fact, most people make the same mistake every time they cut a watermelon, and they don't even realize that this might be causing them to miss the best part of the fruit. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. There is a simple way to cut a watermelon that completely changes the way you eat it, the way you serve it, and even how you enjoy every piece. And the most interesting part of all is that when people discover this detail, they never go back to cutting watermelon the old way again. In this video, you will discover what this mistake is that almost everyone makes, why it happens, and the simple method that can completely change the way you cut this fruit. And once you notice it, it will be impossible not to see when someone cuts a watermelon the wrong way. No one notices this mistake when cutting a watermelon. Watermelon is one of the most popular fruits in the world. Refreshing, sweet, and full of water, it often appears on hot days, at barbecues, family gatherings, and moments of relaxation. Many people have childhood memories associated with a large slice of watermelon served on a plate or eaten directly with their hands. But despite being such a common fruit, there is something curious. Almost no one thinks about how they cut a watermelon. Most people simply grab a knife, cut the fruit in half, and then continue making large half-moon slices. This method feels natural because it is how many people learned to do it as children. But there is a hidden detail in this habit. A detail that goes unnoticed by almost everyone. And that is exactly where the mistake is. The problem is not exactly cutting the watermelon, but how it is being cut. When a watermelon is cut only into large slices, something interesting happens. A good portion of the fruit ends up being less enjoyed than it could be. Think about the situation. When you cut a watermelon into large triangular slices, the center is usually the sweetest and juiciest part. However, each slice ends up with different proportions of that region. Some people get sweeter pieces. Others end up with parts closer to the rind. This creates a small watermelon lottery. But there is a way to cut the fruit that distributes the sweetest parts better and makes it much easier to serve. And this is where a method that became popular on the internet a few years ago comes in. Instead of cutting the watermelon only into traditional slices, some people started experimenting with a different cut. First, the watermelon is cut in half. Then, instead of making large slices, vertical and horizontal cuts are made in the flesh, forming small blocks or cubes. When the fruit is turned over, these pieces almost come loose on their own, creating several watermelon sticks. This method seems simple, but it solves several problems at the same time. First, it makes eating much easier. Instead of dealing with a large slice that can drip juice or be difficult to hold, you have small pieces that can be easily picked up. Second, it improves the distribution of the fruit. Since the pieces are smaller, the sweetest parts end up being shared more evenly. And third, this type of cut reduces the mess. Anyone who has eaten a large slice of watermelon knows that the juice can run down your fingers, onto the plate, or even onto your clothes. With smaller pieces, this happens much less. But the curious thing is that even though this method is so simple, many people have never heard of it. And this reveals something interesting about human habits. We tend to repeat exactly what we learned when we were young. If our parents cut watermelon into triangular slices, it is very likely that we will continue doing the same thing without ever questioning it. This phenomenon happens in many areas of life. In the kitchen, for example, many foods are prepared the same way simply because of tradition. But when someone discovers a different way to do something simple, people's reactions can sometimes be surprising. Many end up thinking, "How did I never notice this before?" With watermelon, this is exactly what happens. On the internet, many videos showing different ways to cut this fruit end up going viral precisely because of this surprise factor. People realize they spent years doing something one way, without knowing there was a much more practical way. Another curious detail about watermelon involves the structure of the fruit itself. The flesh of a watermelon is made mostly of water, about 90% of its total weight. This explains why it is so refreshing. But it also explains why the way it is cut makes a difference. When you cut the fruit into smaller pieces, the juice tends to distribute more evenly, making each piece more enjoyable to eat. In addition, smaller pieces make storage easier. Instead of keeping large slices in the refrigerator, the cubes or sticks can be placed in closed containers, ready to eat. This turns watermelon into a quick and convenient snack. Another interesting point is that many people avoid buying watermelon precisely because they think it takes too much effort to cut and serve. But when they learn different cutting methods, they realize the fruit can be much more convenient than they imagined. There is also a historical curiosity about watermelon. It has been cultivated for thousands of years. Researchers believe its origins are in Africa, where ancient varieties were already consumed long before the fruit spread around the world. Over time, it reached Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas. Today, watermelon is grown in many countries and has become one of the most consumed fruits during the summer. But even with all this popularity, simple habits like the way the fruit is cut have remained almost the same for generations. And that is exactly why small tricks or different methods attract so much attention. They show that even the most common things in everyday life can still hide small discoveries. Another interesting curiosity is that some people prefer to cut watermelon into cubes directly inside the rind. In this method, the rind works like a natural bowl. You simply make cross cuts in the flesh and then remove the pieces with a spoon or fork. This technique is often used at parties and gatherings because it allows the fruit to be served in a practical and visually interesting way. It also prevents the pieces from spreading across the plate. Some chefs also like to use special cutters to create different shapes in watermelon. Stars, circles, and other designs can turn the fruit into a more creative presentation. But in everyday life, the stick or cube method still remains one of the most practical. And even though it may seem like just a small detail, it shows something curious. Sometimes small adjustments in the way we do things can greatly improve the experience. In the case of watermelon, the change is small. But once you notice the difference, it is hard to go back to the old method. And perhaps the most curious part of all is this. For years, millions of people cut watermelons exactly the same way, without realizing there was a simpler and more practical method. Now that you know this, you will probably start noticing every time someone cuts a watermelon into large traditional slices. And you might even show this method to other people. Because many times, what seems like just an insignificant detail can turn into a small discovery in our daily lives. And who knows, the next time you pick up a watermelon to cut it, you might not do it exactly the way you always have. Maybe you will try a different method. And discover that sometimes even a fruit as common as watermelon can hide a small secret that almost no one notices.